What's up, everybody? Pastor Matt here. Are you ready to start a study of the book of Revelation? That's right. We're going to get it started this Sunday. I cannot wait to dive in to the content of John's Apocalypse. I think it was G.K. Chesterton who wrote something like this, that the Apostle John describes many strange creatures, but none as strange as his commentators. That's exactly right. There's been interpretations all over the map related to the book of Revelation. Everybody who takes it super literally, to everybody who takes it very figuratively, to people who are looking constantly in their newspapers or their comic books or to movies or to popular novels for their interpretations. It's true. The content related to the book of Revelation is just all over the map. Let's get a couple of things started here. Let's get it straightened up a little bit right off the bat here. First of all, it's the book of Revelation, not Revelations. That kind of drives me nuts when people say, turn to Revelations chapter 9 or something like that. It is the book of Revelation. Similar to what we say with the Psalms. You know, sometimes you refer to the book of the Psalms or to the Psalms, but if you are calling out a specific psalm, you say Psalm 9, not Psalms 9. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Call it Revelation the proper way, or Revelations the not so proper way. Either way, you're going to be cool with me. We're starting our sermon series this coming Lord's Day on September 18th, and so I want you to join me in this study. It's going to be an amazing study. We plan to spend about 72 weeks in the book of Revelation. At least that's how many sermons there are. I think we're going to take a couple of breaks here and there for Christmas from time to time, maybe other occasions, but about 72 sermons we've planned out here. And I'd love you to join me in that sermon series. We're going to post it, of course, on my YouTube channel, Gospel Fellowship PCA's YouTube channel will have it. And did you know we have a podcast? I don't know if you know that, but if you look up on Google Podcast or iTunes or whatever else, just search for Gospel Fellowship PCA and you can follow along our sermon series there. It's all on there in various forms. My channel, the church's channel, the podcast. You can catch up to all of it. You know, what's interesting is John Calvin never wrote a commentary on the book of Revelation, and it certainly isn't because he wasn't qualified to do so. And he probably would have aided the church tremendously if he had written a commentary. Calvin has commentaries on practically every other book of the Bible, though not every single book of the Bible, but most of them. And we would love to be able to consult what Calvin did if he had done anything with the book of Revelation. There's many places where it's quoted in the institutes and things like that, but there is no commentary by Calvin. And that gives me a little bit of pause, because why should I attempt to do a sermon series on the book of Revelation if even the great John Calvin did not, for whatever reason? Maybe he didn't understand it as fully as he'd like to. Maybe he just died and didn't get a chance to. I don't know. Maybe one of you Calvin scholars can tell me why Calvin doesn't have a commentary on Revelation. But I want to preach on the book of Revelation. And I want to do it when I'm in my prime. I guess I'm assuming that I am in or towards my pastoral prime at this point in my life. I certainly know it wouldn't have been when I was 31 and I was called to be the senior pastor of Faith Church in Brooksville. I know I was immature and ragged on the edges then. I certainly don't want to wait until I'm, I don't know, gosh, in my 70s or something like that. Who knows when I'll retire. So I want to do it while I'm primed. I want to do it while I'm able. I want to do it while I can give it some of my best thought, but I also don't want to delay it forever, because I've been thinking a lot about the book of Revelation, and I feel like I need to draw some conclusions about it so that I can personally understand it better. And not only that, but you know, a lot of the things that are in the book of Revelation related to faithfulness and the perseverance of the saints and the difficulties of this world and the persecutions that are imposed upon the church, these things are very, very relevant to our day and our age, perhaps more so than any other points in recent history, at least for we Western American evangelicals. I know church around the world has suffered greatly for many years, centuries, and practically every generation. Well, in this video, what I'd like to do is set out just a little bit of groundwork for those of you who plan to study Revelation with me. I'm going to throw out some resources for you, things that I think you could get at home to study along with me. I also want to throw my cards out on the table as far as what my presuppositions about this book are. There's much that I have to learn. In fact, that's one thing I'd caution you about, is that don't be that expert who knows every single detail, because probably you're wrong at some points in your interpretation of the book of Revelation. I want to come at it like a student. I want to come at it like a novice. But I also do come at it with some presuppositions that are going to guide my study, and I want you to know what they are. And so I thought it'd be helpful if I would do a video even before I preach the first sermon on Revelation, which is this Lord's Day. I'd love for you to join us. Hey, by the way, if you're new to this channel, my name is Matthew Everhard. I'm the pastor of Gospel Fellowship PCA. We are a Reformed Bible-believing church in the heart of Western Pennsylvania. We'd love for you to come join us in real life and worship at some point. We have services on the Lord's Day, 8:30 and 11. Just Google our name, Gospel Fellowship PCA. All right, let me throw out a couple of sources that I'm going to be using, and then I'm going to throw my cards on the table and share with you some of my presuppositions about the book. First, the Esv Study Bible, which I've done reviews of before. There's a great review of this entire Bible on my channel. I do love the Esv Study Bible. I think this is your all-in-one compendium of both a great translation of the Bible, the ESV, as well as some of the best study notes in the world, some of the best maps, the charts. The contributors to this volume are amazing, so you might want to see my review of this book. Not only that, but when it comes to the book of Revelation, the Esv Study Bible has a fantastic introduction, and it's going to explain some of the things that I'm going to explain in this particular video, so you can read more about some of the views that I'm going to share with you related to ways of interpreting the book. So check out the Esv Study Bible. If you do have one at home, go ahead and read the introduction to the book of Revelation. I'll qualify a few things about that here as we go, but you'll do well to get some basic framework before we start the first sermon. Also, there's a really great commentary on the book of Revelation by G.K. Beale. It's right here, this one. It's called Revelation, a Shorter Commentary. This is 500 pages, so it's kind of interestingly named. It's shorter because Beale has a much longer technical commentary that's part of a really critical New Testament commentary series. This one is meant for anybody. And when I say anybody, I'm not saying it's easy, because there's a lot of hard material, but he writes at a little bit more of a everyday person level than for the academic guild. So if you like G.K. Beale and some of his great stuff, I depended on him in our series on Thessalonians as well. But this would be probably the best commentary. If you want to buy a single volume commentary on Revelation, I would probably say get this one. Here's another one I want to mention. This is even easier. This is by Vern Poythress, who is a true polymath. Man, this guy writes in so many different fields of theology and biblical studies and philosophy and history and science. I mean, this guy is just a genius. And he wrote a very short guide to the book of Revelation. This comes in at less than, well, there it is, 200 pages, including the footnotes section at the end of the book, the end notes. And this is written for, man, again, just anybody, Sunday school teachers, elders, deacons, even pastors, whoever can use this, but it's very simplified commentary on the book of Revelation. And what's interesting is Poythress gives a shout out to Beale at the beginning of his commentary. So I thought that was interesting that these two guys agree in a lot of ways. And one of the reasons that I'm recommending these commentaries is because I agree with them in a lot of ways as well. There's another one, the Revelation commentary in the Mentor Expository Commentary series by Douglas Kelly. He takes a little bit more of a post-millennial and slightly more preterist view of Revelation than the other two, but I think that's going to be a helpful balance for me as well. So I'm going to be using those resources primarily, as well as some other things too. So I'll post a link in the description of this video if you want to grab these resources. I do think that they will be helpful to you. You choose which one you think would be best, whether it would be maybe this one at 200 pages or this one at 500 pages. Either way, I think both these are going to be readable for you. And again, links in the description of this video. Okay, so let's talk about some big mistakes that we don't want to make when we're interpreting the book of Revelation. I already quoted G.K. Chesterton on wild interpreters of his book. A couple things we don't want to do. First of all, and I'm not going to do this in the sermon series, is what we're going to call newspaper prophecy. The kind of things that you would come up with at a prophecy conference. Now, down south, I haven't seen one of these up north yet. I'm sure they exist. Down south, we would have prophecy conferences in the area, and a lot of churches would get really excited about them, and you'd have somebody from out of town, and he'd come in, and he'd basically take his newspaper in one hand and his Bible in the other, and he'd start pointing out things in Revelation. Here's Russia, here's Iran, here's the nuclear deal between I don't know, Obama and Iran or something like that. And The goal was to show how clever you were by taking current events and just kind of importing them into the text. I'm not going to be doing that at all in this sermon series. So if you're looking for some really clever novel interpretations of the book of Revelation, you're just not really going to find that. So I think it'd be better, rather than having your Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other, if you had your book of Revelation in one hand and your Old Testament in the other hand, because John, the apocalyptic writer, quotes or alludes to or refers to the Old Testament more than any other New Testament book. In fact, as Beale tells us, more than any other New Testament book combined. So John is constantly referring to Revelation. So we're going to use, John is constantly referring to the Old Testament. So we're going to use the Old Testament as our explanatory background materials to interpret Revelation far more than we're going to use our newspapers, okay? The other thing we want to avoid is kind of an over-literalistic interpretation about Revelation. I talked about this on Sunday morning in my last sermon on Joel. You will have in some dispensational interpretive camps the idea that you should interpret everything as literal as possible, except when it's absolutely impossible, then you default to a figurative interpretation. That may be true for certain genres of literature like the Gospels or historical books or the epistles, things like that. But I think that Beale is probably right when he says the rule is really reversed in apocalyptic literature. Most of the time you are actually looking for figurative interpretations, and bald, super strict literalism really is kind of not the default mode. It's actually more the exception than it is the rule. So we're not exactly waiting for Godzilla to come out of the water when we talk about the beast coming out of the sea as a very, very obvious example of how we don't want to interpret Revelation overly literally. So we're going to be looking to interpret this book using the appropriate genre, which is apocalyptic, which is basically a souped up form of prophecy, which is already figurative in style and in nature. Finally, the other thing we really don't want to do is we don't want to let popular works such as the Left Behind series or movies or basically anything from Hollywood or big publishing or Big Eva to kind of drive itself into our interpretations of the book of Revelation. So if you see a movie and it features Kirk Cameron or Nicolas Cage as the main actor and people disappearing on airplanes and stuff like that, we're going to want to be careful that that doesn't cloud our interpretation of the book of Revelation. And unfortunately, so much pop culture, from novels, fictionalized theological novels, and just kind of like generic evangelical subculture, we want to be careful that that doesn't cloud and influence our interpretation of the book of Revelation either. So those are kind of the mistakes that we want to avoid. Now, let me share with you very briefly about ways that the book of Revelation has been approached in terms of various interpreters over the ages. I'm going to give you a couple of them that I'm not going to utilize or ascribe to myself, and then I'll give you what I do think is the right approach to the book of Revelation. So these are kind of big words, and again, these are helpfully defined in the ESV Study Bible, so check that out if you can. First, there's a mechanism for interpretation called Preterism. There are good people who are preterists who interpret the Revelation this way. Basically, the word preterism has in it as its root word the idea of the past. And a preterist is one who interprets the book of Revelation as though much of what is being described has already taken place. It is, in fact, the opposite of the left behind or dispensational view. Preterism says that almost everything, perhaps even everything in the book of Revelation except for heaven and hell itself and the return of Christ, has already taken place. And preterists will point primarily to the destruction of the temple and the siege and overwhelming of the city of Jerusalem, which happened in 70 AD, as the primary fulfillment of the prophecies that are given in the book of Revelation. So almost every time you come up with a symbol or an idea or an event or a sequence of events, a preterist will say that's already been fulfilled in the past, primarily, again, at the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, which no doubt is an incredibly significant event in terms of redemption history. Nobody would doubt that. In fact, I would see the destruction of the temple as a great judgment as well. However, I can't go full preterist mode on the book of Revelation because I do think that many things that are described in the book are yet to take place. And Beale points out something very interesting about Revelation. He says that chapter 1, verse 19 is one of the most important verses when it comes to interpreting the book. Let me grab a Bible real quick here. Let's grab this one. I should have prepared a little bit better. Let's see, Revelation 1 and verse 19 says, "Write therefore the things that you have seen, those that are, and those that are to take place after this." Okay, so those you've seen, those that are, and those that are to take place after this. He gives a little past, present, and future aspect there, doesn't he? What you have seen in the past, what things that are, and then the things that shall be. And so I do think that the book of Revelation does have a lot of things that are, and quite a few things that shall be. And so I don't really completely agree with preterism, although preterism does have the advantage of, for instance, chapter 1, verse 1, where it says the things that must soon take place. And so the preterist would point to the destruction of the temple in AD 70, and they would say, aha, see, this is really referring to this epochal moment. Not only that, but there's some other reasons why you might be a preterist. For instance, if Nero is the beast, if he is described in various ways, even the number 666, and Nero he died in like 68, right? So you would have to say there was a pre-70 AD writing of the book. That would defend a preteristic interpretation, but I'm not going to be a full preterist here. Now, there's partial preterists as well who think that much of the book points to 70 AD, but some of it does not. And that may be helpful to some degree. The other view that's kind of opposite to that is the Futurist View. And the Futurist View is what you do find in, for instance, the Left Behind series or dispensationalism. Futurism says that most of the book of Revelation really points forward to the coming of Christ and, in this view, 7 years of tribulation that immediately surround that event, the rapture, pointing mostly forwards, though. And so there's a view that's called linear chronological futurism. Linear chronological futurism, and that's the idea that everything in the book of Revelation is future, still to come. And not only that, but it's linear and chronological because it basically describes a sequence of events that are going to take place in chronological order at some point in the future. Now, I agree that there's some great things in the book of Revelation that are yet future. For instance, the return of Christ in chapters 19 and 20. However, one of the reasons why I don't think we should interpret this book in a linear and chronological method is because while it's true that John continually uses phrases such as "then I saw" or "after that," which would seem to suggest a linear chronological sequence, yet it's also possible that he's merely describing the order of the visions as he saw them, not necessarily how they're going to unfold in terms of some sort of a redemptive historical sequence, right? So I'm not going to interpret everything as though it's in the future and as though it is a chronological, strictly speaking, sequence of events. There's a third view also that I'm not going to utilize very much, which is called the historical view or the historicist view. And this is the idea that the book of Revelation basically gives a sketch of church history. Okay, now, unfortunately, I have to depart from my good friend, my good dead friend, Jonathan Edwards here, because he would have fallen into this camp, as many of the Puritans would. So historicism is commended by a great number of excellent Puritans and Reformed theologians in the past, but I'm not going to go with that motif. So here's what the historicists do. They say that the book of Revelation basically is going to describe the church age, again, pinning chapters and events to particular historical events. So in this view, we want to find out, where's the Pope? Who is Martin Luther? Where is the Islamic invasion of the West? And so they're trying to pin particular descriptions or visions in Revelation to actual historic moments, such as, again, like the split between the East and the West in 1054 or something like that. A lot of people have tried that. The problem, though, is that usually in the historicist view, they end up sketching out church history up until the point of their life. And then after that, the chart's blown up because a lot of these guys were a couple hundred years ago, and they've obviously missed some major events that they didn't include. And so that causes them to have to, if they were still alive, recalibrate their entire system. So I don't think that's necessarily going to be the best way to do it either. So what is the best mechanism for interpreting this book? Well, I'm going to do what Poythress and what Beale do, and that is to interpret this book from what Beale calls a redemptive historical idealism. Okay, redemptive historical idealism. This is the idea that what the book of Revelation gives us is a lot of visual images of redemption history. Okay, so we're going to see some things that have already taken place. A lot of it's going to point back to Christ and the cross and the Spirit of God and perhaps the sufferings of the early church. But many, many things that are also very, very relevant today. And so a lot of the truths about the persecution of God's people are applicable in every single era of church history. And not only that, but there are still yet many things that are to come. And so in the idealistic interpretation, the book of Revelation is not necessarily describing that linear chronological sequence of events that are yet to take place, but rather John is giving us vision after vision after vision of deep and abiding truths that seem to be true for all Christians in that entire era from Pentecost until the return of Christ. And if we're taking an idealistic view, then we're going to be seeing the major themes of redemption sometimes over and over again from different angles. So for instance, we'll have themes of creation, fall, the sovereignty of God, salvation in Christ, the need for the perseverance of faithful people, persecution of the church by an unbelieving world, the reality that God is going to crush evil and ultimately judge it, and yet also the joy that we have being found in Christ and being amongst his saints. And so in the idealistic interpretation, we're not necessarily bound to try to find these things happening in our newspapers, nor are we bound to necessarily pointing this to 1517 with Martin Luther at the Wittenberg door, or things like that. So in the idealistic redemptive interpretive grid, let's say, you can have several events that are actually described multiple times. For instance, the judgment of the end of the world, I think, is one of those things that the book of Revelation actually gives us several different chapters that describe the judgment of the world. Okay, so in this sense, then, idealism, what it does is it takes the best of each one of the other interpretive mechanisms and utilizes their strengths while avoiding their weaknesses, if that makes sense. So there'll be aspects of preterism where we're seeing things that have taken place in the past. There's also aspects of futurism where we're looking out to things yet to unfold. Perhaps at times we might even use a little bit of historicism, although most of the time what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking for those great truths related to the gospel that are relevant to God's people in every age. In other words, the book of Revelation was not just written for the saints in the first 100 years of Christianity, nor was it written for those who will happen to be alive in the last few years before the return of Christ, but rather that the book is teaching great and abiding truths about the gospel that are applicable and relevant to every single Christian between Pentecost and the return of Jesus Christ at the end of all things. Now, let me say a little bit about millennial positions before I close out this video, because a lot of you probably wonder what my millennial position is. Let me just lay my cards out on the table here, and I would describe myself as an optimistic amillennialist, okay? Optimistic in regard to the success of the gospel going out throughout the whole of the world, but I'm also amillennial because I'm not quite as utopian in my view as a true post-millennialist may be. Okay, so I think that the book of Revelation, as an optimistic amillennialist, describes the story that is relevant for the entire church age. In so doing, then, amillennialists really look for one great eschatological event that is yet to come. That is the return of Christ. We do not distinguish between the rapture and the return. We say those are the same thing. When Christ returns, he will gather up the people, he will rapture up the people to himself, and then he will judge the world. And so when we talk about things like tribulation, we're not necessarily looking, as the dispensationalists do, for 7 years of tribulation between those two things, the rapture and the return, because we don't separate them. We believe that there is one great eschatological event, the return of Christ. And therefore, the whole of the church age requires us to go through tribulations of various kinds. Okay, so that's a pretty obvious difference between us and premillennial dispensational folks, okay, though we love them and they're our friends. At the same time, we believe that the millennium, which is described in Revelation 21-10, that reign of Christ, is taking place now. He is currently the king over all things. He is the resurrected and the ascended Christ who is seated at the right hand of the Father. Therefore, he currently reigns. And so when we speak of the 1,000 years, we're talking about a very long time. There's a symbolic number for us describing the current heavenly reign of Jesus Christ. But we're not quite as optimistic as the post-millennialists. The post-millennialists believe that the church age kind of gradually gives way to a dawning great age of light and prosperity and success, such as that the nation states themselves are largely Christianized before the return of Christ. There would be one point where I would depart from my post-millennial friends, though I love their optimism about the Great Commission, and I share that with them as an optimistic amillennialist. Yet I'm not quite as bullish on the idea that the nation states themselves are going to be fully converted to Christendom before the return of Jesus Christ. Okay, so just reviewing here, and again, the ESV Study Bible does a great job of introducing these. Dispensational premillennialism emphasizes a secret rapture, a 7-year tribulation, a literal 1,000-year reign, followed by an Armageddon and the judgment of the world. Adherents there including John Nelson Darby, Schofield, Lewis Schaefer, Charles Ryrie, D.L. Moody, Hal Lindsey, Jerry B. Jenkins, David Jeremiah. Those guys would all be in the dispensational premillennial camp. That would be the camp that I probably have the least familiarity and sympathy to. There's post-millennialism. Again, this is the idea that the church age will give way to a great era of light, success, and prosperity as the nations are thoroughly Christianized by the advances of the church. You have great adherence to this position, though, and so we don't want to completely disregard it. Everybody from Perkins to Matthew Henry to John Owen to Cotton Mather, Jonathan Edwards, again, my favorite scholar there, my favorite pastor, Warfield, Machen, Greg Bonson, John Frame. A lot of these guys are post-millennialists, and I respect all of them, okay? I'm just not quite as bullish on the conversion of the nation states. I see a lot of hatred of the nations, Babylon in the book of Revelation, for the saints, the people of God. So I'd be more of an optimistic amillennialist, and I think people in my camp would include Augustine, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Gerhardus Voss, Louis Berkhoff, Michael Horton, Kim Riddlebarger, Sam Storms, more contemporary guys there. So again, in amillennialism, we're not looking for a literal 1,000-year period. We say that Christ is currently reigning on his throne over the entirety of the church age. We're looking for the return of Jesus Christ as the great eschatological event in which he will judge the world. He will draw his people to himself, and then we will enter into the eternal state, heaven or hell, one or the other. Okay, so there's my cards on the table. So if you're looking to study along with me, I'd love to have you for this sermon series. Again, just look for it on my YouTube channel or the church's YouTube channel, our podcast, and look for me to interpret this book from an idealistic perspective and an optimistic amillennial outlook. Okay, thank you so much for checking into this video. I do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.